Hey, welcome back, fellow historians, to another installment of our review sessions leading up to the AP National Exam. In this session, we're going to be looking at period 5, but we're going to take a look at part 2, pretty much the key turning points of the actual battles in the Civil War, and then we'll look at Reconstruction. But just to review a little bit, let's go back in time and kind of bring the context into our story, our review for today. And we do need to go back a little bit into period 4 and pick up with the divisiveness that we saw between the North and the South. We saw divisiveness with regards to the Northern tariffs that were being placed on the Deep South. If you recall, a tariff, either a revenue tariff generating enough money for the government, is enough to bring money in but not hurt individuals in the Deep South, where a protective tariff is going to lock up imports from coming in, spur manufacturing, and keep the northern manufacturers' markets sequestered to the Deep South. But then when they go to export their crops, for instance, to Europe or Latin America, Caribbean, or Asia, they find themselves being beset by the tariffs that are now being in place by those parts of the world. So northern tariffs, we put in quotation marks, are going to further exacerbate the divide between the North and the South. We see the Missouri Compromise. Jefferson's call it a death knell to the Union, a line that's being placed in the sand, really putting anybody north of that as free, anybody south of that slave. The nullification crisis. This is the exposition of South Carolina, in which John C. Calhoun is going to push back against Andrew Jackson and say, we don't have to follow this law. Very much echoing the Virginia and Kentucky resolves that were written under Thomas Jefferson. And finally, in period 4, beginning of period 5, after great territorial acquisitions in the United States in the Mexican Cession, the purchase of that Mexican territory after they were defeated by the United States, the issue really became prevalent on what to do with all this land. We've got Texas, we've got the Mexican Cession territories of Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California, and this Oregon territory. What do we do with all this stuff? She's a slave, it's free. How is this going to transpire? And so there's going to be several political solutions that are going to be what I call band-aids on a wound that continues to bleed, such as Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, the issue of popular sovereignty moving into the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 54, in which that bloodshed, I'm going to argue, is going to be some of the first blood spilled in the fight of the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas is going to lead us to then John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry, and then on to Fort Sumter, which we'll talk about in a sec. And then the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision in 1857, saying that Dred Scott is still a property, piece of property as opposed to a human being, and that he was no longer free once he crossed that Missouri Compromise line with his owner, when his owner, a surgeon, was reassigned to Wisconsin and Illinois. We're going to see abolition meetings that are taking place all throughout these short-term social causes, abolition meetings based on the fugitive slave laws that were in place, right? The North thought that these were terrible laws, immoral laws that they weren't going to follow. Now, I don't want to, and I pause here for just a second, paint a picture that everybody in the North was morally superior and didn't like slavery. Just the same as I'm going to say, not everybody in the South owned slaves, right? In fact, if you look in aggregate at the whole Southern population of the South, um, a small percentage of individuals own slaves. So I'm always cautious as a history teacher of painting the North as this landscape of free soilers that thought slavery was immoral and they weren't racist. And then painting the South as being this deeply racist, entrenched territory that was full of slavery. There are nuances between that, but by and large, most of the abolition movements, much of those gatherings and protests under the fugitive slave laws did come from the North. Underground Railroad, led by Harriet Tubman, is going to move about 100,000 individuals through a series of network stations, farms throughout the landscape to get them to safe haven, up rivers, etc. And finally, literatures and newspapers like The Liberator, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin are going to bring the issue of slavery to the forefront of the American discussion. And we also take a look at the election of 1860. That's going to be the last straw when Lincoln finally assumes the presidency in the first of what are going to be 2 terms as president, the second one being cut remarkably short by his assassination. and then the firing of Fort Sumter, a weapons depot for the North that was attacked, and then the first land battle ensuing with the Battle of Bull Run. So all of those are going to be linked by the trunk of this tree, and that is slavery. So again, I've said this in the past session, I'm going to reiterate it again. When you're talking about the main causes of the Civil War, a casual observer of U.S. history will say slavery, and they're not wrong, but it really is many more components that are brought into this. Now, and I'm just being very direct, I don't think the Civil War was an issue fought over states' rights, as many proponents will say. The retort I have to that is, okay, what states' rights? What rights are the states trying to push for, right? Or it was an economic issue. Okay, well, what was the basis of the economic debate, right? So we can't escape that issue of slavery moving into this greater argument of the Civil War, and that which even lasts to this very day. It's going to come down to a numbers game, really, in the end, with some of the advantages. One of the big components that you'll see in the course APUS history is asking causes and effects, and comparing and contrasting. So what are some of the long-term, short-term causes of the Civil War? What are the effects of the Civil War? How do we compare the North? How do we compare and contrast that with the Deep South? The North is just simply going to have more individuals. You can see this in the chart of the number of soldiers that are there, the number of states versus the Confederate states. And so in what is somewhat of a rather inhumane and grotesque description, they could absorb more casualties and still be victorious, right? When we look at places like Antietam and Gettysburg, where tens of thousands of lives were lost, I don't think any of these battles, I mean, as a historian, I'm always, hesitant to say that the North was victorious in Gettysburg, or the South was victorious at the Battle of Antietam. Nobody was victorious, right? If we get right down to it, but who suffered the least casualties and triumphed in that regard? It's easy to see that the North was able to do that just because of the sheer numbers they had in both backup reserves in comparison to the Deep South. Now, the South did have strategists, Civil War generals, military generals on the Confederate side that were good military strategists that are bringing their expertise from campaigns like we saw in the Mexican-American War, and even some as late as the War of 1812, some advisors, older advisors, if you will, from the War of 1812, providing some advising, if you will, for the Civil War itself. And what's, I think, interesting just from a historical standpoint, the veterans of the Civil War marched in parades alongside the troops coming home from World War I. Right now, of course, the Civil War veterans, you look at actual photographs of them marching alongside the World War I vets, they are remarkably older, in their 90s, on with walking sticks or whatever aids they had at the time. But I just again think it's remarkable that World War I's generation was able to humanly and physically connect with the Civil War generation. Civil War generation was humanly and physically able to connect with the War of 1812 generation. So just, I'm nerding out for a second on history. If you look at your investigation guide, I'm not going to do PowerPoint karaoke and read you this chart, but this is showing you the extensive Civil War comparisons between the Union and in the South. What I think is just remarkable is looking at just a quick glance, factory production being 10-1 and textiles 14-1, right? With just uniforms and blankets and cots and stretchers. So all of those things, like textile, armament, we think in terms of a military industrial complex like the North producing just nothing but weapons, but really think of the infrastructure they need to build as far as tents and sleeping bags and uniforms and shoes. They were able to re-equip quickly. They had the railroad tracks to get the materials to the troops much more quickly. And they were not as destroyed as the South. We looked at a map in the last session in which a lot of the battles were fought on Southern soil. And so those croplands were burned. I mean, look at Sherman, Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea from Atlanta. He would rip up railroad ties and tie them around trees. They even lampooned it as Sherman bow ties, just because of that kind of Napoleonic scorched earth policy, if you will. So transportation was superior. The naval presence was superior in the North. So it's just amazing that the South was able to have the kind of, again, I'm now going back to not using the word victory, but the kind of successful campaigns in certain battles against the North, based on the sheer numbers, they held their own quite well, if you will. And that's going to be because they had also the ability to fight on their own terrain, right? We don't talk about period 8, but in Vietnam, one of the greatest casualties of the American experience in Vietnam is we go over there not familiar with the territory. And so the Viet Cong, the VC, were able to maneuver through that territory more easily because they were familiar with that terrain. And that proved to be an advantage for the Confederates, as well as a positive goal, because they were seeking independence from the Union, much like the United States was seeking independence from Great Britain years earlier. There's your kind of ninth grade world geography, eighth grade US history, a population density map analyzing just the sheer numbers on the north. You could really see the Mason-Dixon line as if it was just a wall between the two entities. Getting us all the way to the Mississippi, right? I think the population density map could look quite similar to this even today, if you kind of step back and glance at it, with maybe a little bit more in kind of the Denver Metroplex and maybe in the Phoenix southwestern area in Vegas. But by and large, this is still pretty much the same type of density map that you would see. And so it's going to be a numbers game. More human beings equal the ability to absorb more losses. Rail networks are going to be really a big part of this. They're going to expand significantly in period 6, but just instead of looking at the rail networks on the surface and saying, oh, they have more into rail than they don't, what I want you to really pay attention to, and I'll get my kind of my pointer out here, is that this area is known as kind of a choke point. This is the head of the Baltimore-Ohio line. Right. And if you are able to cut this off, right, which there's Richmond, Virginia. Okay. So if you're able to cut this off, look at the area that you're able to isolate from the deep south. So if goods or if manufacturing items or imports from these eastern coasts were to make their way to the south, you don't really need to spend an exhaustive amount of time destroying all this rail. You could simply cut it off at the choke point here, cut it off here in the Ohio Valley, and cut it off there at St. Louis to try to get the control of the Mississippi, the Ohio River Valley, and of course along the eastern seaboard. So those various choke points were also problematic for the South by cutting off areas. So they could move goods and stuff throughout the deep South, but they really had that inaccessibility with northern markets. And they did anyways, because they were in the middle of the war with them. You wouldn't continue to trade with an adversary. If you look at the industry, I was about to say industrial, and then I combine that with industry. If you look at the industry and agriculture of 1860s, again, a very quick little surface view, seeing the majority of those textiles. The reason why I'm emphasizing textiles is because think of all the things that textiles are really a part of. And again, earlier I said stretchers, tents, clothing, bandages. So that wartime footing, very much similar to World War I and World War II, is going to prove to be significantly more advantageous to the North. Partner that with, of course, manufacturing as well. Cotton, as we're going to see, while the South thought that that was going to be their ace in the hole, that they've got cotton, they can partner that cotton with Great Britain or European markets, and then Europeans are going to continue to keep that economic relationship between the Deep South and Europe. That's going to prove to be a fruitless endeavor for two reasons: the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll talk about in a second, and Europe was simply turning their eyes then to South Asia and to Egypt for those spices and for that tobacco and for that cotton. So the South was like, all right, what do we do now, right? Key turning points in battles. Again, I've always said that we're not going to be responsible for putting up a Quizlet and just memorizing these battles, but it is important for us to navigate the Civil War and to see it in areas that really allow the war to move this way and quickly turn and go in this direction. What happened here? It turned this way and it went in this direction. If we look at the American Revolution, they're going along this way. Battle of Saratoga got the French involved, right, and got French support, which then secured the American colonial victory, right? If we get to Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered. That was the end of the war. So let's do the same thing with the key turning points in battles like we would for Midway, Okinawa, Iwo Jima, that kind of stuff. So Bull Run is going to be the first of the land battles that are going to take place. And I talked in the previous session about it just being about 13 and a half, maybe 14 miles from the locale of Washington, D.C. In fact, not humorously, I certainly don't want to say humorously, but Washington residents thought that this was just going to be a little skirmish. It was going to be a fun little event to watch. The rebels, they call them, from the Deep South, are going to come up, create quite a kerfuffle, and kind of tick off the North and then go back. And it was just going to be a protest. right? That's what they thought. So people bring their children out. They set up a picnic on the fields. They bring out the buggies and the babies and the strollers, and they get their glasses out, and they look, and what then ensues over the next 6.5 hours is an incredibly bloody battle. So much so that it expands and gets out of control. The North begins to retreat back towards DC. They trample on all the individuals that are out there picnicking. Walt Whitman, the famous writer and poet Walt Whitman, was actually a journalist out at the Battle of Bull Run and had to climb a tree to avoid the approaching and retreating Northern army. And Bull Run itself was a success for the South, and was played in the newspapers as a Northern success because Lincoln was very quick to control the media during this time period and didn't want the morale of the North to be damaged by this really humiliating defeat. And it was at this point that Lincoln got with his advisors and said, this is going to be a long, drawn out war that we need to really set ourselves up for. Antietam is going to prove to be very problematic for the North. Antietam is an incredibly bloody battle. They're going to claim a Union victory. And again, I use this term victory very sparingly. But the Union are going to claim to be a victory, but then the South is also going to claim this to be a victory. And it seems as if these battles are not decisive in who is really winning in the hearts and minds of the media, as well as recruiting efforts for both the North and the South. But it is going to be played as a Union victory to many, but a Confederate victory to many. But what is so telling about the Battle of Antietam, what makes it so monumental, is that it is at the point at which Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I want to pause on this because I'm gonna have a slide on the Emancipation Proclamation in just a minute. And we initially, as a casual historian, will think, oh, that's the document that freed the slaves. And it was this big kind of warm, fuzzy document that Lincoln issued to try to bring about the moral issue of slavery. And it was anything but. And we'll talk about that specifically here in just a second. The Battle of Gettysburg is going to be the northernmost battle. It is an absolute must win for the North. If the Confederates continue to open up that pipeline from Antietam all the way up into the North and circle around Washington, D.C., they could enclose and capture D.C. And if the nation's capital were conquered or captured by the North or the South, that would be the end of the war, so to speak. So this was an absolute battle, and Gettysburg is going to be the point in which Lincoln goes north, and I'll talk about it in just a second with his Gettysburg address. Vicksburg is going to be a northern victory securing the Mississippi River. There are battles, Charlottesville and others that are fought as you continue to go farther west, but one of the more farther west battles that are going to be, there are smaller skirmishes as far as even in the Oklahoma Territory and Texas, but as far as big battles go, right at the edge of the Mississippi River is going to be the Battle of Vicksburg, and this allows the North to secure the Mississippi River. So a couple of things are happening. Stick with me. Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan is cutting off the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. Battle of Vicksburg controls the Mississippi River. Gettysburg is holding the southern advance up north as a stronghold. So we're seeing continued victory after victory now with the North against the South. And it's going to be ultimately the brutal Union offensive of Sherman's march to the sea that's going to get the players to Appomattox Courthouse to sign the surrender. So again, turning points in the battle, seeing where the Civil War is framed, and just looking at the overall 30,000-foot view of the war as opposed to getting into the battles. You could pull a book, off the shelf here on just any one of these battles, right, and read about that specific event. During the Civil War, Lincoln initially wanted to preserve the Union, right? That was his goal, not to free slavery. We would say, what's the Civil War about? Slavery. Why did we have a Civil War? To end slavery. The Civil War was to preserve the Union. Now, yes, the issue was over slavery, but it's to initially preserve the Union. And later on, once the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, it's going to reframe the purpose of the war. And what I think is interesting here is it was an attempt to prevent the Confederacy from getting an alliance with Europe, because Europe, right, culturally, philosophically, has already ended the slavery issue. And if at this time the South has not released itself from their own economic and social bondage of slavery, then how could Europe continue to trade and do business with the Deep South? So any kind of diplomatic or economic support to the Deep South would be challenging for them because of the issue of slavery. And so any states that were in rebellion against the Union would find safe passage through the Emancipation Proclamation and the slaves that are in it. So a slave was not free unless they were able to get to the North, and that was going to encourage those African Americans to flee from the South and fight for the North as well. But it was at this time initially, right, any states in rebellion against the United States would find themselves not being able to hold on to those slaves through executive order. And as we say, the initial ending of slavery, if you will, I guess the totality of the abolition of slavery is going to occur with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. That Gettysburg Address is going to personify the struggles of the slaves in an effort to preserve the Union. At the dedication of a memorial for the veterans of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln stands up and addresses in just very, very, very quick and short speech. The photographer couldn't even set up his camera in time. It was so short, 7 years ago, of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's going to give the North kind of that positive goal now of preserving the Union. Remember, up until this point, the South had a positive goal of fighting for independence. Now the North has a positive goal of preserving the Union. It's going to really shape the overall emotional, the pathos, and the philosophical trajectory of the war. So in part 2 of this, we have 3 rights that we need to resolve at the conclusion of the war. Appomattox has been signed. Grant and Lee signed the surrender there. The South is now back under the purview of the United States, but we have to resolve 3 specific issues. And is it the responsibility of the Union to welcome back the South? Or is it the responsibility of the South to get back with the North? Right? Those 2 issues are going to really be a challenge to what's going to occur over these next really 12 years with the time period of Reconstruction. What do we do with all these human beings that are now free? What do we do with the slave states that are now American states that are free? And what do we do with the former slave owners or the leaders of the Civil War, right? So all of these need to be bore out in 2 very specific ideologies. You have Lincoln's plan, and you have the radical Reconstruction plan. Now, Lincoln, being the kind of soft proponent of really gently nursing the South back into the Union, is going to, through his second inaugural address, really only require 10% of the voters in 1860 to sign a loyalty oath to the United States. And they only need to ratify the 13th Amendment. Remember, the states ratify those amendments, the state legislatures do. And that's, of course, the freeing of the slaves. And Southerners could gain political and, some property rights back. And this, of course, was viewed as being way too lenient. And what I think is one of the great what ifs in American history is, had Lincoln not been assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, could he have initiated this plan, and how could that have softened the future battles that are going to occur in this time period of Reconstruction? Because you have the congressional plan, the radical Republican congressional plan that's going to, and I put radical in, and this is the term that the historians use, but I put it in the context of the time, right? Radical seems negative, right? It was radical. It was no, it just was really. Who's going to disagree with the fact of a Freedmen's Bureau? I mean, this is an organization that's being put forward to encourage voting and schooling and social services for newly freed African Americans. So this is, in essence, I don't think radical, but something that's positive, or at least not looking at radical in a negative sense. We do have the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It's going to be the first time we're actually going to address the term civil rights in American history as a piece of codified legislation. We could make connections, even though we're not covering period 8, to Lyndon B. Johnson's Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act of the mid-1960s under his Great Society. But the Reconstruction Act, I think, is going to be the most punishing aspect of this in 1867. This is going to have kind of military districts. So one individual is not from Savannah, Georgia, so to speak, but they are from District 4. And this is going to keep troops in the districts, marching, keeping curfew, keeping an eye on things. It does quell things like an advance of Jim Crow laws and segregation and hate groups like the KKK. But what it does do is further deepen the resentment that the South has, right? The war is over. Why do you still have troops standing on every street corner, kind of monitoring our activity? They're going to require that the 14th and 15th Amendments get ratified, and that Confederate leaders could not hold office and that debt would not be repaid. So this, if you want to draw some complexity comparisons, it might be interesting in your writing if you were to say the the specifics of the Treaty of Versailles in punishing Germany, right, with the reparations and the war, the guilt clause, could have some comparisons to the radical Reconstruction plan post Civil War. Might be an interesting thing to flush out as a really an interesting comparing and contrasting. But you'll see that this is going to take place, like I said, for the better part of the next 12 years. And the theory and the thesis I'm going to make is that the government failed in its efforts to rebuild the country and reunite it. And it's not until period six, the titans of industry, Carnegie and Rockefeller, and these guys through free market capitalism are going to be the true reconstructionist of the nation, leaving the South largely disenfranchised, but for the most part being the real foundation for a new industrial America. So the legacies of Reconstruction, and we're going to frame it through political, and we're going to frame it through economic and social conditions. The political conditions, the Freeman's Bureau and the SCOTUS rulings, specifically with Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm going to talk about Plessy v. Ferguson in period six, so we'll get there later on. But the economic conditions in the Deep South, really it's going to be a third world country until post World War II around. And the social conditions are going to build this animosity, this idea that the South will rise again, blatant racism, really evidenced by the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan, which was an organization initially created to try to disenfranchise African Americans from voting, and then the regrettable self-justice act of lynching and public hangings is going to take place. So Reconstruction as a government institution is going to prove to be a failure on both sides of the equation. And while there were some African Americans that did benefit, Hiram Revels was elected to the Senate. We have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, right? We have the Freeman's Bureau, but at the same time, you have Jim Crow, the Ku Klux Klan, and lynchings. And that's going to be kind of the yin and the yang, taking us all the way through to the 1920s and certainly up through the 1960s, 50s, and 60s with the American Civil Rights Movement. And I would also be hesitant I would be remiss, excuse me, if I didn't mention that we are ignoring Native Americans during this time period. We're going to see rapid increase in conflicts between Native Americans and Western settlers. And we're also really putting off to the side women's issues. The Women's Christian Temperance Union is going to start to rise up in period six. But again, suffrage is only going to be for men still at this time period. So many civil rights still need to be addressed, along with even the rampant nativism that's taking place with immigrants coming in. So this Reigniting Manifest Destiny, this is kind of the precursor going into period six, right? The Homestead Act of 1862 is going to be a key component of Lincoln's plan to get Northerners to move out west, a great opportunity to provide some complexity and some comparison or contrasting, or CCOT would be the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Homestead Act of 1862. Again, the government parceling out certain land, and in turn you have to provide something for the Union. There's going to be increase in that immigration with Irish and Germans, anti-Catholic movements out of the back east. And of course, in connecting us to period six, this is an opportunity for economic leaders to emerge, not political leaders, but economic leaders to emerge amidst this rapid urban growth. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes period five, all the way from the very beginnings of the Mexican-American War to Reconstruction. And now we forge on ahead into leaving the Jeffersonian agrarian society of America behind to the rich venture capitalists of the East Coast, the most money, oil, steel, and trains, the titans of industry or the robber barons, in period six coming up next time. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to welcoming you back then. Have a great day.